So today we'll be talking about Chapter 17, Section 4, and it's titled Progressivism under Taft. William Howard Taft succeeded Theodore Roosevelt as President of the United States. Teddy Roosevelt was a Republican, a member of the Republican Party, as was Taft. Roosevelt was so popular that he was able to endorse, support, and see elected a member of his own party after Roosevelt retired. And that's uncommon. In fact, if you look at the history of elections, it's more common for a two-term president to see an overturn in power, such as what we've had in the recent election, where a member of a party serves 2 terms and then the electorate votes a member of a different party in as president. Anyway, so this is not uncommon, but it is interesting that Taft was endorsed and supported by the previous president. However, Taft took the party and took our country in a very different direction, and that's what we're going to be talking about today with the legacy of William Howard Taft. All right, so in 1908, Republican William Howard Taft won the presidency with Roosevelt's support. He promised to follow up and continue Roosevelt's legacy of progressivism, yet he was much more cautious. He was nowhere near as charismatic as Teddy Roosevelt. In fact, he has this odd distinction of being our physically largest president, yet was not nearly as imposing as Teddy Roosevelt. So, again, while he promised to continue this legacy, in many ways he was disappointing to his predecessor. So, first off, let's talk about some of his accomplishments. Taft signed the Payne-Aldrich Tariff. It was meant to be a compromise between the stalwarts, members of the Republican Party that wanted to impose heavy tariffs to restrict foreign trade, to protect domestic industries. But then there were also the progressives who wanted to remove tariffs to use international trade as a means of breaking up monopolies and corruption. And so while it was meant to be a compromise, a moderate tariff, it actually angered members of both parties. The progressives were angry because they feared that he was going to abandon low tariffs and that this was really a slap in the face for the progressive movement. However, where Taft really upset Theodore Roosevelt was over public lands. When Taft named Richard Ballinger to Secretary of the Interior, that's the cabinet-level office whose job it is to oversee all public lands. So, Pisgah National Forest, the Great Smoky Mountains, the Blue Ridge Parkway, all of these places, all federal lands, are overseen by the Department of the Interior. Now, this is a very important position, and we need to watch closely to see who President-elect Trump is going to appoint as Secretary of the Interior, because this will affect us, these public lands that we use so much, that are such a big part of our county. When Richard Ballinger, for example, was nominated Secretary of the Interior, he placed these reserved lands in the public domain. What this allowed him to do was to sell reserved public lands for profit. Can you imagine? I mean, I do try to remain objective as your history teacher, but I will be marching and protesting if Pisgah National Forest is up for sale. I mean, and I think that's pretty general. We're all going to be upset about that. But that's the sort of thing that was happening here. When Richard Ballinger started putting up public lands for sale to the highest bidder, well, Teddy Roosevelt heard about it. He was actually hunting lions in Africa. He became so upset, he came back. And we're going to talk about his comeback in just a moment. Now, Gifford Pinchot, the man that had managed Pisgah Forest when it was owned by the Vanderbilts, was so upset that Ballinger was placing lands under his supervision up for sale that he publicly protested this. Because he's the head of the Forest Service. That's his job. He testified in court against Ballinger saying that he does not have the right to do this. Well, Ballinger was his boss, and so he fired Pinchot. In fact, this became a famous Supreme Court case, Schneck versus the United States. Carl Schneck was a friend of Pinchot's who took this matter to the U.S. Supreme Court. And in his honor, 276 that goes into Pisgah Forest, next time you're with your family driving up to the Parkway, that's called Schneck Highway in his honor because he defended these public lands that we hold so important. So between Taft's messing with our public lands and his support of tariffs, he's causing division within the Republican Party at this time. In fact, the Republicans, which at that time had the reputation of progressivism because that's what Roosevelt had really championed, split over Taft's support of the Speaker of the House, Joseph Cannon. While Roosevelt, once again, had this reputation of being a trust buster, a lion tamer, an aggressive pursuer of social justice, an aggressive pursuer of economic opportunity. He hated monopolies. And he was really the first Republican president of his time to be so outspoken like that. And Taft really represented several steps back. And so that did split the party. Joseph Cannon, Speaker of the House of Representatives, also further weakened the progressive agenda. And so the progressive members of the Republican Party began to ally themselves with the Democratic Party. In fact, today, again, when you think of what does it mean to be a Republican versus what does it mean to be a Democrat, well, it's not so simple as just one thing. You can't just say, oh, these guys believe this, these guys believe this. Both parties represent a coalition of diverse interests. Among the Republicans, you have evangelicals who are hoping for an end to abortion, among many other things. Also among Republicans, you have large business interests. You also have the disenfranchised, angry, poor whites. You also have many other groups. And then among the Democrats, you also have a diverse coalition. You have social justice reformers. You have a number of what some would call wealthy white progressives. You also have a large minority base in the Democratic Party. And so, again, it's a diverse coalition of competing interests who have compromised around these two parties. Well, in 1910, something big happened. Roosevelt had made the Republican Party the Progressive Party. He was just that charismatic. And Taft had really took a step back. And he had angered the progressives within the Republican Party to such a degree that we see a big shift. The Republican Party after 1910 no longer represented these progressives. They all moved to the Democratic Party. And so from now on, we're going to see the trust busting, the end of those working for social justice, the civil rights, etc. That's all going to come from the Democratic Party after 1910. In the 1910 midterm elections, with the support of the Republican progressives who changed parties, the Democrats got control of the House, and essentially, as you've seen in the past 8 years, or past 6 years to be more exact, when a president has a different party than Congress, it's difficult to get things done. Okay. Taft was so upset, understandably so, that his legacy had been tarnished. That at the 1912 convention, Taft ran against an incumbent. This is uncommon. This is really unheard of. Well, it's possible we could see this. Let's say that Trump is so unpopular as president that the Republican Party turns against him and decides to nominate someone else. Maybe Pence, maybe Boehner, maybe Mitch McConnell. I mean, it could be any number of people, leaders within the Republican Party. We could see Rubio come back. You just never know. But it's very uncommon. It's not unheard of that a party can turn against their own incumbent president. In 1912, that happened. That very thing happened. Roosevelt, was planning on retiring. He was a young president. He was a young man. He was going to go travel the world and enjoy some adventures. He's done his civic duty. But no, he comes back. See, in 1912, he ran against the incumbent president for the Republican nomination. And he split the Republican Party by forming his own party. While he lost the Republican nomination because most Republicans chose to support the incumbent, Roosevelt went off and formed his own party. For example, imagine if Trump had lost the nomination. Politics aside, he was threatening to do this very thing. He was threatening to run as an independent. He would have split the Republican nomination. It would have been a very different result. When Roosevelt formed his own party, which essentially split off the progressives that were left in the Republican Party, his call was for more voter participation in government, universal women's suffrage, and legislation to regulate labor and business controls. And so now we really have three candidates for president. A lot of my friends and family have been dismayed by the fact that there weren't more options for president. Many felt that no one truly represented their interests. And that can be a difficult thing within a two-party system. Since these two parties have to compromise and collect such a diverse coalition of voters, some people say, well, no one fully represents me. And that's an understandable criticism. That's certainly how my parents felt, and many were dismayed by the lack of options. Well, when you have three, this can be a difficult situation as well. Because with three or more, imagine the Republican primary where you had 12. No one person ever truly got a full majority of the vote. And so what this really did was it split the Republican Party, allowing Woodrow Wilson to have an easy victory. So the election of 1912. Wilson endorsed the progressive platform because now the progressives have joined the Democratic Party. He called his platform the New Freedom. He was going to run on many of the same promises that Roosevelt had already assured. Stronger laws against monopolies, a reform of the banking system, lower tariffs, which would equate to more international trade. But Wilson, like Roosevelt before him, took it that extra step. In fact, he called monopolies evil. Evil. Really, this is some of that populism that we've been hearing in this recent election. That big businesses are controlling the economy, are controlling our government. It was Roosevelt who said, without the watchful, resolute interference of the government, there can exist no fair trade between business and the individual. Now, I've also heard a lot from people saying, I wish there had been more choices. I wish there had been strong third-party candidates. Many people said, well, hey, Gary Johnson seemed interesting. Hey, maybe Jill Stein seemed interesting, but I knew there wouldn't be enough support. We're in a swing state, so you got to go with one of the two. And that can be frustrating as well. Maybe one of those independents did represent your interests more closely. There was also a strong independent in this race. So in reality, we had At this time, 4 people in the election of 1912. And to be honest, there were even more, but 4 worth mentioning. You now have Teddy Roosevelt. You now have Taft running for re-election. Woodrow Wilson representing the Democratic Party. And Eugene Debs. Yes, Eugene Debs, the famous labor leader who had formed the American Railway Union, who had led numerous labor strikes. Eugene Debs wanted to run on the Democratic Socialist platform. In fact, he was arguably the first Democratic Socialist to run. And so he actually did manage to get a significant portion of one of the most popular third-party candidates we've ever had. But bottom line, this led to an overwhelming electoral victory in 1912 for Woodrow Wilson. And when you see an overwhelming victory, and another reality about elections, most people vote down party ticket. I mean, most people wrestle with and think about which party they should join. And then once you do that, most people think, well, it's a simple decision from there of who am I voting for president, and then they just click either all Democrat or all Republican. Most times. That's called down party voting. That's how most people vote. And so when you have an overwhelming victory for someone like Wilson, who was a Democrat, you're also going to see the Democrats take over the House and Senate.
In 1910, America was a nation of 90 million, and for most of us, this is what we meant by horsepower. Life in this time was simpler. There was no television or radio, and coal cost less than $5 a ton. One out of 4 Americans owned a horse, but if you owned a car, you were 1 in 200. William Howard Taft was in the White House. Under President Roosevelt, Taft had served as first governor of the Philippines, as Secretary of War, and he had Roosevelt's strong endorsement when he won the presidency in 1908. But Taft was not the vigorous and crusading politician Roosevelt was, and by 1912, Taft's conservative policies had so angered the former president that Roosevelt decided to challenge Taft for presidential nomination. Republican Party regulars gave Taft the nomination, but that didn't stop Roosevelt. Endorsed by the Progressive Party, Teddy campaigned for a return to the White House, saying he felt strong as a bull moose. The Democratic nominee was Woodrow Wilson, former president of Princeton University and governor of New Jersey. Though Taft and Roosevelt had once been friends, the 1912 campaign was bitter. Roosevelt attacked Taft's conservatism and called for a new nationalism with sweeping progressive reforms, workmen's compensation, minimum wage, and child labor laws. With Republican loyalties divided, Wilson won the election of 1912. Roosevelt carried only 6 states. Taft owned 2. Wilson, like Roosevelt, was a progressive politician. He campaigned for a new freedom, and once at this he called Congress into special session. New laws brought sweeping changes: banking and currency reform, a federal trade commission, the income tax, and even stronger antitrust laws, all enacted to protect the public interest. The political reforms of Woodrow Wilson's years were among the most significant in history. There were demands for change by more radical elements, and these would take more time. Working conditions and low pay led to many strikes and demonstrations, and sometimes determined protests in the name of social justice did succeed, like movement for child labor laws. Long hours, dangerous conditions. Who would protect the children in the factories and on the farms from conditions that made them sick and old by their teens? Though President Wilson was a progressive politician, he first believed that federal regulation of child labor was unconstitutional, but strong sentiment and progressive demand caused him to endorse a child labor law, ensuring its passage by 1916.